I used to mark my birthdays quietly, one cup of tea, one slice of cake from the bakery down the street, and a phone kept face up on the table, just in case. Year after year, the phone stayed silent. My son never remembered my birthday, not once after his marriage, but I remembered everything. I remembered the way he used to count coins from my purse to buy school notebooks. I remembered the nights I stayed awake sewing clothes so he could look decent among richer classmates. I remembered selling my bangles to pay his university fees. I remembered clapping the loudest when he graduated, even though my hands were shaking from age and exhaustion. And I remembered the parties, lavish ones. Crystal chandeliers, catered dinners, themed decorations, photographers, live music thrown without hesitation for his wife's family. Birthdays, anniversaries, promotions, even just because celebrations. My son hosted them all with a smile so wide it almost hurt to look at. I was never invited early, always an afterthought. Come if you want, Mum. Text sent hours before guests arrived. No seat reserved, no introduction. Just a quiet corner and a plate handed to me like charity. I told myself not to feel bitter. Mothers are supposed to be patient. Mothers are supposed to understand. Then came this year. On my birthday I waited again. Morning passed. Afternoon passed. Evening settled in like dust.
No call, no message.
Nothing. That night I opened the old wooden box under my bed. Inside were documents my son had never cared to ask about. The house he lived in, registered in my name. The small but thriving logistics business, started with my savings, legally owned by me, temporarily handed over to him in trust. The fixed deposits, the emergency funds, everything I had quietly protected for years. I didn't cry, I smiled. The next morning I went to a lawyer. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I simply reclaimed what was mine. The house was transferred back under my full control. The business authority was revoked. Accounts were frozen pending restructuring. All legal, all clean, all calm. I sent one message to my son, happy birthday to me. I've decided to remember myself this year. For 3 months, there was silence. Then reality hit them. Bills stacked up. The house no longer felt like theirs. The business stalled without my signature. The lifestyle they were used to, gone. The parties stopped. The invitations dried up. Friends disappeared. The wife's family, once so celebrated, suddenly became distant. And then the begging began. First a hesitant call. I didn't answer. Then messages, Mom, let's talk. Mom, there's been a misunderstanding? Mom, please. Finally, they came to my door. My son stood there, eyes hollow. His wife stood behind him, no designer bag, no practiced smile. They didn't sit until I told them to. They didn't speak until I looked up. We were wrong, my son said, his voice cracking. We took you for granted. I looked at him, the boy I raised, the man who forgot where he came from. You didn't forget my birthday, I said softly. You forgot my value. They begged. They promised change. They swore loyalty. They said everything people say when comfort is taken away. I listened. Then I stood. I don't want parties, I said. I don't want gifts. I don't even want apologies that come too late. I paused, letting the silence do what shouting never could. I want respect when you have everything, not when you've lost it. I kept the house. I kept control of the business. I gave them enough to stand on their own, nothing more. They left quietly. That year, on my birthday, I baked my own cake. I lit one candle. I made one wish. Not for love, not for recognition, but for peace. And for the first time in years, my phone rang. It was me, finally calling my own worth back. For years, her life revolved around a simple, aching routine: wake up early, prepare a quiet breakfast, sit by the window with a cup of tea, and wait for a moment that almost never came. She was a mother who had given everything she owned, everything she was, to raise her son. She remembered the exact weight of him as a newborn, the way his tiny fingers wrapped around hers, and the promise she made in her heart that day. No matter how hard life became, she would never let him feel alone. She kept that promise. He did not. Every birthday of his was marked with care. Even when money was tight, she found a way, sometimes a small cake, sometimes a handwritten card, sometimes a simple home-cooked meal with his favorite dish. She clapped the loudest at his school events, stood at the back during his college functions, and waited up late on nights when he came home late, pretending she wasn't worried, just so he wouldn't feel burdened. As he grew older, she assumed he would understand these sacrifices one day. She believed gratitude came with time. But after his marriage, something shifted. Her birthdays became invisible. Not intentionally cruel, just forgotten, which somehow hurt more. Each year, she told herself the same lie: he must be busy. He must have forgotten the date. He will remember later in the day. Morning passed into afternoon, afternoon into night, and the silence stayed unbroken. She learned to smile through it, convincing herself that a mother should not expect anything in return. Love, she told herself, was meant to be selfless. What made the silence heavier was not just his forgetfulness, but his enthusiasm elsewhere. She saw it all on her phone screen: grand celebrations, sparkling decorations, laughter filling expensive halls. Her son stood proudly at the center of these events, hosting lavish parties for his wife's family. Birthdays, anniversaries, even casual get-togethers were treated like royal occasions. He planned every detail, spared no expense, and posted pictures with captions full of affection and praise. She would scroll quietly, her thumb pausing over the screen, wondering how someone who could remember every important date for others could forget the woman who gave him life. When she attended these gatherings, she felt like a stranger in a place built with her own sacrifices. No one introduced her properly. No one asked if she was comfortable. She often stood on the sidelines, holding a plate she barely touched, watching her son laugh with people who had entered his life recently, but seemed to matter more. His wife's family was treated with honor and attention, while she was acknowledged with a polite nod at best. Each time, she told herself not to feel hurt. She reminded her heart that love should not be transactional. Yet the pain accumulated quietly, like dust in an unused room. She never confronted him. She never complained. She never reminded him of her birthday or the years she spent denying herself comfort so he could have a better life. She feared that speaking up would make her seem needy, that asking for remembrance would cheapen the love she once gave freely. So she stayed silent, believing patience was strength. But patience, when stretched too thin, turns into invisibility. The final birthday arrived like all the others, quiet and unannounced. She woke up with a small sense of hope, dressed neatly, and set her phone beside her cup of tea. Hours passed. The phone remained still. As night fell, the truth settled in her chest with a familiar ache. She was not forgotten by accident. She had simply been placed last. In that moment, something changed, not in anger, but clarity. She realized that love without respect slowly erases the person giving it. The neglect she accepted so easily was not humility, it was self-abandonment. And for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she had endured without acknowledgement. That birthday did not break her. It woke her up. She had never spoken about the papers she kept hidden away, not because they were secret in a dramatic sense, but because no one had ever cared enough to ask. They rested in an old file wrapped in cloth, tucked beneath her bed like a quiet promise to herself. Every document carried the weight of a decision she had made long ago. Decisions born from love, caution, and an understanding of how quickly gratitude could fade when comfort became routine. Years earlier, when her son had been eager and hopeful, she had helped him build his future piece by piece. The house he proudly called his own had been purchased with her savings. The money she accumulated from decades of careful living, skipped luxuries, and sleepless nights. She put the property in her name, not out of mistrust, but out of instinct. Life had taught her that security was not something you announced. It was something you quietly protected. When he married and asked for stability, she allowed him to live there freely, believing a mother's support did not need formal acknowledgement. The business followed a similar path. When her son spoke of starting something of his own, full of ambition and ideas, she was the first to believe in him. She invested not just money, but time, attending meetings she barely understood, signing documents, standing as a guarantor when no one else would. Legally, the ownership remained with her, but operational control was handed to him without hesitation. She trusted that respect would naturally follow responsibility. She assumed that love would always outweigh entitlement. She never mentioned the legal structure because it felt unnecessary. She didn't want power over her son. She wanted him to stand strong. She believed that holding the reins loosely was a form of kindness, a way to let him feel independent while knowing there was a safety net beneath him. What she didn't realize was how invisible that safety net would become in his eyes. Over time, the home felt like his by right, the business like his achievement alone, and her role slowly faded into the background. While he spent freely, hosting lavish gatherings and impressing his wife's family, She watched quietly, never questioning the source of the comfort. She never reminded him where the foundation came from. She felt no need to demand gratitude, convinced that a good son would eventually remember. Her silence was mistaken for weakness, her generosity for permanence. Yet, every time her birthday passed unnoticed, every time she stood ignored in a room filled with people celebrating under a roof she paid for, a small voice inside her grew louder. It reminded her that protection without boundaries often becomes exploitation. She began to understand that love did not mean surrendering control forever. Still, she waited. She hoped. She gave him time to realize on his own. The moment that finally pushed her toward action was not fueled by rage but by exhaustion. Sitting alone after yet another forgotten birthday, she felt the years settle on her shoulders. She thought of the sacrifices she had made, the quiet strength she had carried, and the respect she had never demanded. For the first time, she asked herself a question she had avoided for years. What happens to a mother when she gives everything and asks for nothing? That night, she opened the file beneath her bed. As she spread the documents across the table, she felt no triumph, only a calm sense of grounding. These papers were not weapons. They were reminders that she had once been wise enough to protect herself. She realized that safeguarding her future did not mean she loved her son any less. It meant she loved herself enough not to disappear completely. She understood then that control did not have to be loud. It could be quiet, lawful, and dignified. The house, the business, the finances, none of it had ever truly left her hands. She had simply chosen not to hold on tightly. And now, with clarity replacing denial, she knew that the same strength that once built her son's world could also restore her own sense of worth. In that silent room, with legal documents spread before her, she made a decision that would soon change everything, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. The morning after her forgotten birthday did not begin with tears or dramatic resolve. It began quietly, the same way most of her days did. Soft light slipping through the curtains, the kettle warming on the stove, the house still and patient. But inside her, something had settled into place. The waiting was over, not the waiting for an apology or a phone call, but the waiting to finally choose herself. She dressed neatly, not because she was going anywhere special, but because dignity mattered to her, especially now. As she folded her shawl over her shoulders, she glanced once more at the file resting on the table. The papers were no longer just documents. They were proof that she had not been as powerless as she once believed. She took them with her and stepped out, closing the door behind her with a calm she had never felt before. The lawyer's office was modest, lined with shelves of heavy books, and the quiet hum of a ceiling fan. When she sat down, her hands did not tremble. She spoke slowly, clearly, explaining everything without bitterness. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. She simply stated facts, ownership, authority, trust, and how that trust had been taken for granted. The lawyer listened, nodding as he reviewed the documents, confirming what she already knew: everything was legal, valid, and fully within her rights. Signing those papers did not feel like betrayal. It felt like balance. She authorized the transfer of the house back into her direct control, ensuring no one could sell, mortgage, or claim it without her consent. She revoked operational authority over the business, pausing accounts and restructuring management under her supervision. Each signature was deliberate. Each stamp was final, not rushed, not emotional, just firm. The world she had built would no longer run on assumptions and silence. What surprised her most was the absence of guilt. She had expected to feel cruel, maybe even heartless. Instead, she felt lighter. For years, she had confused endurance with virtue, believing that a mother's love required endless sacrifice without acknowledgement. Now she understood that love without boundaries teaches others how to disregard you. This decision was not punishment, it was correction. She sent one message to her son. It was brief, almost gentle. There were no accusations, no long explanations, no reminders of what she had done for him. She had learned that explanations invite arguments, and arguments dilute resolve. The message was enough to inform him that changes had been made and that they were lawful. Nothing more was needed. The reaction came swiftly. Confusion first, then disbelief. Calls followed, unanswered. Messages piled up, swinging between irritation and forced politeness. She read none of them in full. She had already said everything that mattered, with her actions. Over the following days, the effects rippled outward. The house, once a symbol of comfort, became uncertain ground. The business slowed without her authorization. Payments stalled. Plans were postponed. The noise of a life built on borrowed stability suddenly went quiet. She did not interfere. She did not gloat. She simply stepped back and let reality do what words never could. For the first time in years, her days belonged to her again. She woke without dread, slept without resentment, and sat in silence without feeling invisible. Friends noticed the change in her voice when she spoke, steadier, calmer, no longer apologetic. She realized how much of herself she had muted to keep peace in a relationship that only demanded more. There were moments when memories tried to weaken her resolve, images of her son as a child, his laughter, his dependence. She allowed those memories to exist without letting them control her. Loving someone did not mean surrendering to being overlooked. She could hold love and boundaries in the same hands. By the end of that week, she understood the true power of what she had done. She had not taken anything away. She had simply stopped giving without respect. And in doing so, she reclaimed something far more valuable than property or money, her sense of self. The world had not ended. It had finally become quiet enough for her to hear herself again. The change did not announce itself with chaos or confrontation. It crept in slowly, like a tide pulling back before anyone realized the shore was exposed. At first it was small things, subtle enough to be dismissed, easy enough to explain away. A payment that didn't clear on time, a meeting postponed because approvals were pending, a casual gathering canceled with a vague excuse. Life continued, but without its usual shine. For her son, the shift felt unreal. He had lived for years in a world where comfort was automatic and support invisible. The house was simply home. The business was his. Money flowed, bills were paid, and celebrations came easily. He had never stopped to ask why things worked so smoothly. He had only assumed they always would. When that assumption cracked, confusion took its place. The parties were the first to disappear. The elaborate plans, the rented halls, the overflowing tables, suddenly they felt unnecessary, even impossible. Excuses replaced invitations. Friends who once praised his generosity stopped calling. Without the sparkle of hosting, he realized how many connections were built on convenience rather than loyalty. The silence from those people was louder than any argument. Inside the house, the atmosphere changed. The walls that once echoed with laughter now held tension. Conversations between him and his wife grew sharp, then strained, then quiet. Worry crept into their voices late at night as they whispered about expenses, responsibilities, and what had gone wrong. The security they believed was permanent had been resting on something they never acknowledged. The business, once the source of pride and identity, began to stall. Without full authority, decisions piled up unresolved. Employees grew uncertain. Partners hesitated. What had seemed like a solid operation revealed itself to be fragile without the foundation that had always supported it. For the first time, he faced the reality that success had never been his alone. As weeks passed, the lifestyle they were used to became unsustainable. Luxuries were replaced with calculations, comfort with caution, confidence with anxiety. The wife's family, once eager participants in every celebration, started to pull away. Visits became rare. Calls went unanswered. Support faded when there was nothing left to gain. The warmth that once felt genuine turned conditional. That was when regret began to surface. Not just regret for lost comfort, but for neglected relationships. Her son replayed memories he had ignored before, birthdays forgotten, messages left unread, the quiet presence of his mother at the edges of his life. For the first time, he questioned how he had mistaken her silence for indifference instead of patience. Shame arrived slowly. It showed up in the empty calendar where parties once lived, in the bank statements that demanded attention, in the realization that he had celebrated everyone except the one person who never asked to be celebrated. He began to understand that the stability he relied on had been built by someone he had stopped seeing. Months passed, and pride eroded under pressure. What remained was honesty he could no longer avoid. The life he had taken for granted was gone, and no one else was coming to rescue him. The people he had prioritized were absent when he needed them most. The one person who had always stood quietly behind him was the one he had pushed aside. 3 months after everything changed, he finally admitted what he had been avoiding. He could not fix this alone. The collapse was not just financial or social, it was moral. He had failed to honor the source of his strength, and so, with humility replacing arrogance, He turned back toward the door he had ignored for years, carrying not confidence or entitlement, but the weight of consequences and the clarity that comes only after everything unnecessary falls away. By the time they stood outside her door, the world they once knew had already fallen apart. The house behind them no longer felt like a home, and the future ahead of them looked uncertain and thin. Pride had been worn down slowly, day by day, until there was nothing left to shield them from the truth. They had lost control, lost comfort, and, most painfully, lost the illusion that they were self-made. Her son raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. In that pause lived every memory he had ignored, his mother waiting late at night, her quiet smile when he came home, the way she never asked for anything except a little time. His wife stood beside him, her posture stiff, eyes lowered. The confidence she once carried so easily was gone. This visit was not planned out of strength, but desperation. When the door opened, she stood there calmly, no anger on her face, no triumph in her eyes. She looked older than before, but also steadier, as if the weight she had carried for years had finally been set down. She did not rush them inside. She did not ask why they had come. She simply stepped aside, allowing them to enter, giving them the same courtesy she had always given, even when it was undeserved. They sat where she indicated. Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. It was her son who finally spoke, his voice unsteady. He did not start with excuses this time. He did not blame circumstances or misunderstandings. He said the words he had avoided for years, that they were wrong, that they had taken her presence for granted, that they had assumed her support was permanent and unconditional. As he spoke, his voice broke. The loss of control had stripped him bare, leaving no space for arrogance. He admitted how the lifestyle had collapsed, how people they once celebrated had disappeared, how he had finally understood that respect delayed is respect denied. His wife followed, her apology quieter but sincere, acknowledging the distance, the neglect, the way she had accepted privilege without gratitude. She listened without interruption, no folded arms, no shaking head, just quiet attention. When they finished, the room fell silent again. They waited for forgiveness to be offered quickly, for relief to come the way it always had before, effortless, automatic. But this time was different. She stood slowly, not to end the conversation, but to reclaim it. Her voice was soft, but it carried weight. She told them she had never needed parties, never wanted gifts, never expected grand gestures. What she had needed was remembrance, recognition, respect given freely, not demanded by loss. She explained that their apologies mattered, but timing mattered too. Regret born from discomfort was not the same as awareness born from love. She did not accuse them of cruelty, she accused them of carelessness, which she said was often far more damaging. Carelessness teaches people they are optional. They begged then, not dramatically, but earnestly. They asked her to restore what she had reclaimed, to help them rebuild, promising they would do better, be better. She believed they meant it. But belief alone was no longer enough. She told them she would not abandon them, but she would not return to the old arrangement either. She would help them stand, not carry them. She would support effort, not entitlement. The house would remain hers. The business would stay under her control until they proved responsibility without reminder. Independence, she said, was a lesson best learned without shortcuts. There were tears. There was relief mixed with disappointment. But there was also something new, clarity. They understood now that love did not mean unlimited access, and forgiveness did not mean forgetting. When they left, they did so quietly, not defeated, but changed. They had come expecting mercy. They left with a lesson. She closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a moment, breathing deeply. For the first time in years, she did not feel drained by giving. She had given wisely. That night, she slept peacefully, knowing that whatever came next would be built on truth, not obligation. And that was the strongest foundation she had ever laid. In the quiet that followed their departure, she sat alone and reflected, not with bitterness, but with an unfamiliar sense of peace. For the first time in her life, she was not measuring her worth by how much she gave or how much she endured. The house was silent, yet it did not feel empty. It felt whole. She realized that what she had done was not an act of revenge, but an act of restoration, of balance, of dignity, of self. For years, she had believed strength meant patience and sacrifice meant love. She had worn those beliefs like armor, even when they cut into her skin. She had allowed herself to shrink, to be overlooked, to exist quietly in the background of a life she helped build. Now she understood something crucial: kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be taken for granted. True strength, she learned, is knowing when to stop giving in ways that erase you. Her decision had not been easy, but it had been necessary. By choosing not to lash out, not to humiliate, not to destroy, she had discovered a power far greater than anger. She had reclaimed control without cruelty, authority without noise. The lesson she delivered was firm, not harsh, clear, not vengeful, and that made it unforgettable. Days passed, and her life began to take a new shape. She reorganized her mornings around her own needs. She walked more. She laughed more easily. Friends noticed the difference. There was a steadiness in her voice, a confidence that did not seek approval. She was no longer waiting for a call that might never come. She had stopped placing her happiness in someone else's memory. She also allowed herself compassion, not just for others, but for the woman she had been. She forgave herself for staying silent so long, for believing endurance was the same as love. She acknowledged that she had done the best she could with what she knew then. Growth, she realized, does not come from shame but from clarity. Her son called occasionally. The conversations were different now, shorter, more respectful. No assumptions, no demands. He listened when she spoke. He chose his words carefully. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Boundaries had changed the language between them. Distance, paradoxically, had created room for respect. She did not rush reconciliation. She let time do its work. Trust, she knew, was not rebuilt with promises, but with consistency. And for the first time, she was not afraid of being seen as too firm. She had learned that firmness was not the opposite of love. It was its structure. On her next birthday, she did not wait by the phone. She baked a cake again, smaller this time, but sweeter. She invited a few friends who had always shown up without being asked. They laughed, shared stories, and celebrated quietly. When her son called that evening, she answered calmly, without expectation. His voice carried sincerity, not obligation. She listened, thanked him, and moved on with her night. That moment mattered, not because he finally remembered, but because she no longer depended on it to feel valued. Her greatest victory was not reclaiming property or authority. It was reclaiming herself. She had taught a lesson without raising her voice, without burning bridges, without losing her humanity. She had shown that dignity does not need an audience, and self-respect does not require permission. In choosing boundaries, she chose peace. In choosing dignity, she chose freedom. And in choosing herself, she finally received the one gift she had been denying for years: the right to be seen, even by herself.